Ilya Farber from Singapore, and thank you for joining me today. So, what is your assessment of the status quo of artificial intelligence, Ilya?
Well, there's,
Yeah, that's
there's a lot
you
going
can
on.
have a short answer or long answer.
Sure. I mean,
Yeah.
it's funny because there are a lot of questions about what it's going to do.
Right.
You know, what's going to happen to us, what impact it's going to have. One thing that makes it hard to think about for me right now is even if we have good ideas about that, it's not clear how much it matters.
What do you mean by that?
Because right now there's not a lot we can do about it. Like
That's an
the
interesting
products
argument.
are being rolled out without anyone's permission, right?
Uh-huh.
And in the past you could maybe talk about regulation,
Right.
but right now, I mean, the Trump administration is not going to do any interesting regulation.
Yeah.
Period. They're just not that kind of people. And the main companies are all in England and China. China, I mean, they're going to do certain kinds of regulation, right? But like the sort of normally you might have a discussion about like what should the safety policies be and what should the regulatory approach be. And I think right now, none of that conversation is likely to have much impact. A little bit maybe. I mean, the trust and safety people at Anthropic and to a smaller extent of the other companies,
Right.
Google maybe might, they'll be listening, right? But I think right now it's sort of like you're watching the sort of tidal wave coming, right? And saying, okay, where is it going to hit? What effects is it going to have? And you can talk about it, but it's still coming. So I think to me that makes it's interesting but challenging to think about because even if we have ideas, it's not clear how much they matter. We can, and I mean there are some specific cases. Like I think legally, there are big questions like how much liability should these companies have, and when are they going to start seeing real legal costs to encouraging children to kill themselves or that sort of thing, right? So I think legally there may be interesting questions. There are some interesting practical questions like how should education be dealing with this, right? How should universities and how should primary, secondary schools be dealing with the fact that students now have access to AI to help with their homework? I think those are interesting practical questions. But like the big questions, what is it going to do to society, and when is AGI coming, and AI consciousness and all those questions, right? They're fun to think about, but to me right now it feels a bit like thinking about them is sort of like a hobby. You can do it for fun, but it's not clear how much impact it's going to have. And that's a strange feeling.
Is it an optimistic viewpoint or a pessimistic viewpoint? I mean, because so you're basically saying that no matter what we might think about AI safety, AI ethics, AI alignment, and so on, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter very much. It'll matter on a slower time scale or more indirectly. If we come up with good ideas, they might get used, but indirectly. I mean, that said, I'm not a pessimistic person, right? And I think I've never been an AI doomer.
Not like Elisa Yudkowsky.
No, not at all.
No.
I think probably his approach has done more harm than good in the long term. But I think so. It's interesting and important to please come in.
Yeah, Takashi Ikegami has. Takashi, you should probably join us in this conversation about AI. Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah. So I mean, it's interesting to think about the long-term scenarios, but to me, the most interesting questions are the more short-term ones.
Yeah.
And I think the longer term, it's very hard to think about, and I think we should have modesty in thinking about it. And part of the problem with people like Yudkowsky is he doesn't have modesty. He's one of the kinds of people, he'll spin out a long chain of deductions, and deductions are very fragile. If any of your premises is flawed or depends on some statistical likelihood, the whole thing can go wrong, right? And so people people draw these charts of, I mean, same with singularity types of arguments, right? People say, well, the rate of change is increasing, it's only going to be magnified by itself, and so at some point we'll have a takeoff. Well, I mean, okay, but we might nuke ourselves first, or we might have some radical change in the governance structures, or we might become focused on something else that suddenly climate change or aliens could land. I mean, weird things happen, right? And so I think a lot of those arguments about sort of more long term, like especially if you think about long term AI safety and how to train superintelligence to help us, I think the details of the systems matter. And right now we have no idea what those systems are going to look like. And so I think any any sort of in-depth or mechanistic discussion of how you might train such systems right now really feels quite pointless to me, relative to other questions which are more important about how we can shape their impact in the short to medium term. How do we help people understand how to deal with AI? How do we prevent companies from using AI in harmful ways? Using the power that they get from being the ones who are creating the AI. How do we help people integrate AI into their lives and be productive? How do we deal with unemployment? Those questions to me are more pressing, and also it's more realistic to think about good answers to them. Whereas AGI, if you think it's coming soon, okay, then it's pressing. I don't think it's coming soon. I don't think it's coming anytime very soon. And so
some people predict that they would come in a few years.
The AI 2017. No, I
don't buy them.
I don't buy it at all. And I don't want to seem. In a way, I'm dismissive of those ideas, but it's not casually dismissive. It's not like, oh no, nothing like that could ever happen. It's having really thought it through and look about the details of the system. My considered opinion is that it's not anytime soon, right? And a big part of the reason is I think transformer architecture was a huge leap, and I think, well, as I mentioned, when the last time I came here and gave a talk, I think in a way the biggest leap that we achieved with transformer architecture was to have an AI that can read and index sort of the whole internet and all written language, and then give us a way to interact with that material. That was new, right? That was amazing. We didn't see it coming. It's remarkable, but it's done. It's happened. We now have AIs that have access to basically all of written knowledge, right? And so the idea that if and that produced a tremendous rate of change in the usefulness and the power that they had. The idea that would continue to build on itself, I think, is not realistic or not well justified, because that was a big leap that's now done. We've ingested the whole internet.
Right.
And there might be another leap like that at the point when we get sort of real-time audio, video interaction with the world. That could be another big leap.
Much more sensory modal.
Very deeply multimodal. But I think that's still quite a ways off. And so I think the idea that sort of the current rate of change will compound and accelerate, I think, is not justified. I think if anything, the rate of change is it's not gonna flatline, but I think it may slow down a bit. We had a big leap with LLMs. People are now sort of twiddling around, finding ways to make them more efficient, to better use them, agentic harnesses and stuff like that. But I think it's not gonna be a leap as big as the one we had with the invention of transformers.
How universal do you think the large language models? There are systems that would go beyond large language models?
In what sense?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
I mean, for now, large language models seems to be kind of, they are capable of building world models and combined with physical AI, they would be able to do things. And
I think the world model stuff is still very early. I think there's some potential, but I think it's still very early. Basically LLMs are very good at language.
Right.
And they're good in both directions. They're good at reading it, they're good at producing it. They're also good at understanding the user's language, which I think is one of their key powers, right? They're the best user interface for a computer that we've ever had, right? That you can now, in natural language, talk to it and revise your instructions over time. That's amazing, right? So I think that's great. And I expect it'll continue to improve somewhat. Right now, forget very multimodal, they're not even very audiovisual. It's harder to, say, draw a diagram and say, make me something that looks like this. That'll come. But I think right now it is a limitation. They're still by far best at speech, right?
Right.
But it's interesting, they're so good at speech. And I think people, it's so natural to interact with them that people, I think, don't stop to appreciate how weird it is. You can, and I think the best way to do this, when you're using an AI yourself, play with using different language when you talk to it. So sometimes, like when I'm talking to an AI, sometimes I'll ask a question in my sort of natural, kind of roughly academic style, right? And then sometimes I'll try acting more like, not a kid, but in much more basic language, right? Or I'll try using much more casual language or things like that, right? Just on this trip, I was looking for advice on shopping, right? So I threw in a bit of Japanese to show that I wasn't a completely clueless tourist, and it adapted to that. It gave me advice. It included some Japanese words in the response, right? So I think, that's fun to play with, but it also just shows the power that the LLMs have to meet users wherever they are, at whatever level they're at, which I think it really is amazing.
So how universal is next token prediction? Computationally, it's quite capable, but
yeah.
do you think the system is beyond that?
I mean, eventually.
Yeah.
But it's. Right now, I think the focus is mostly on keeping that core of next token prediction and then building things around it. So, agentic harnesses are sort of right now the hottest one, right? And I think there will be other things like that, where you take that same core, or before that it was RAG or something like that, right? So people will find more ways to make them useful in different manners for different people. That's still going to have limitations. It's still going to be very hard to get rid of confabulations. It's so core to the architecture, and I think, psychophancy is already reduced somewhat, but it's also always a problem. I think one of the things people really have trouble properly understanding about LLMs is they don't really have a distinction between reality and fantasy, right? They're reading text of all kinds, including fiction and nonfiction.
Do humans have distinctions between reality and fantasy?
Most of the time.
Okay.
Most of the time.
Okay.
But so the point is, people, if you want the AI to role play with you, it will. If you want the AI to tell you facts about where to go shopping or something like that, it will. I think users generally don't understand that for the LLM, those things are quite interchangeable. By talking to the LLM, you sort of jointly create a world, and it plays along with you in that world. But yeah, I think it's very hard for people to understand or remember that it's that kind of thing, right? So this is why, one of the ways people get driven crazy by these things, right, is they'll share some slightly weird idea they have that maybe they wouldn't have shared with another person because they would be embarrassed. Right? And then they'll be surprised that the AI validates it. They'll say sometimes it seems to me that the people around me are like talking about me or something like that. And to another human, you'd be embarrassed to say that. You say it to the LLM, and the LLM says, yeah, I think that too, or you may be onto something there. Let's explore that, right? And so then you dig deeper into it, and really what the AI is doing is just collaboratively telling a story with you. But people think it's telling them truths about reality. And it's a real problem. It's very hard to keep track of.
So are you worried about multibook, OpenClaw, all these new...
I think it's sort of self-limiting because the people who use it are going to destroy themselves. Right?
What do you mean by that?
People are already getting their bank accounts cleaned out and getting their businesses destroyed. And it's fun to play with. But right now, if you give those systems access to anything important, well, you shouldn't, right?
So these people will just implode rather than explode.
There will be enough examples of people imploding that everyone else will get more careful, yes. Right now it's a very early adopter technology, and it's fun, right? But I think it's in that stage. It's sort of like old, like early homebrew computers or something like that. If you're interested in it because you're a hobbyist, you can play with it, and it's also a little bit dangerous. Eventually, there will be much more locked down versions, that'll be more corporate and also less interesting.
Right. Any chance of AI winter from here?
I do mostly believe the theory that there's going to be some sort of financial implosion. Like OpenAI is the clearest case. I just don't see any path to OpenAI being plausible or profitable, unless you think they're going to get superintelligence, and I don't think they're going to get superintelligence, right? So if what they're going to get is just differences in degree from where they are now, they don't have a moat.
Right.
There are already lots of other foundation models. There's nothing unique about their chatbot interface. They have a huge user base, but that's because it's free, right? So I think financially, and then I'm not that into finance. I read a little of it just for fun, but it's not something I spend much time on. But I'm reasonably persuaded of the arguments that these companies and NVIDIA are all investing in each other, and eventually it's payday is going to come. right? That, you know, that they're not going to be able to meet their obligations. Now, what happens then, I don't know. I mean, those companies could be destroyed, but there will still be data centers, and the technology still exists, right? So, even if every current major AI company goes bankrupt, right, that doesn't mean the AI goes away, because other companies can still use the same architectures. And also, people will have built a lot of data centers that now will be looking for clients, right? So I think there won't be the same kind of AI winter as we saw in the past, where people sort of gave up on AI as a plausible technology, and it was difficult to get funding. I think particular companies may fail. I think the role of LLM-based AI in our lives is not something that's going to be taken away. You know, it's too useful already, right? There are too many ways to use it already. The ways we use it might change, but I don't think it's not like the genie is not going to get put back in the bottle.
Okay, so at this time, I think it would be great to invite Takashi Ikegami to join our conversation. Takashi, please. So you've been hearing kind of dialogue, and now it'll be dialogue. Takashi Ikegami, please. So Takashi.
Yes.
Yes. What do you think of? So before you came, Ilya was just arguing that it is impossible to control AI development, AI safety. Anyway, practical sense. So what is your take on that?
Well, because my professional, what I have been doing is so-called artificial life, which means that when our technology or machines become spontaneously decide what they want to do, and that's what one of the most important criterion for understanding life in terms of our artificial systems, right? So that what multiple or open claw is now showing us is something that kind of our dream came true.
Your dream came true, not your nightmare. Okay.
No, it's
A nightmare is one kind of dream.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, but to me, making artificial life is something like open claw is now doing to us. Like we don't have to, tell what to do or what to, implement, but they can decide what they want to do, and then that's very, very like spontaneous, life-like system.
Yeah.
So that's what, or you can call it nightmare, but I can call it, it's our dream came true.
That's interesting because that is consistent with what Ilya was saying, because ecosystems in general are not controllable. I mean, all these biodiversity thing.
Yes.
It's not controllable, right?
No, right.
You cannot control. So.
But the point is, it's not random.
Okay.
It's not randomly,
right.
organized. It's not just like a turbulent flow we see in the fluid mechanics.
So Ilya, what do you think of Takashi's?
Yeah, well, I mean, right now, I think the big difference from historical AI life is that these systems are not self-replicating yet. Not much. I mean, you can have an agent spin up other agents, but in a very limited way, right? But we, right now we don't see such systems where you get like self-replication with evolutionary variation, right? But I'm sure academics are already doing it, and we'll probably see more of it in the wild sooner or later, right?
You think so? Because, for example, LLM has a lot of variations already, right? Not replicating by itself, but the human researchers are replicating and making their variations of it, right?
Yeah.
So there are tons of different types of LLM that exist already, and you cannot erase them all because it's already. And I'm pretty much sure that they can self-evolving and then self-replicating in a software layer, right? So that you cannot stop it. But that's also another characteristic of living systems, right? You cannot wipe them out at one time, right? So in that sense too, that I think it's quite an interesting realization of artificial life. This time. But can I say something?
Yes, please. Yeah.
So I was thinking that those LLM it's not just an interface. Well, people sometimes misunderstood that they are just a new kind of tool or interface, but they are kind of new, what do we call agency? Well, there is a subjectivity that exists already. That, well, I think, right? So if you have your very good friend, or Ken Mogi, right, and then in order to understand him, I don't want it to open up the brain and to see a causal relationship within this neural circuit or anything, right? So the black box is black box. Then you really have to respect what he does or what he thinks. So this emotional feeling, from the emotional feeling to the way to understand what he does or how I trust him, is because that's not the causal relationship is the way to understand him. There's something else, right? Our way of respect him exists within a relationship between me and him, right? And then LLM is the same thing. In between me and LLM, that's the way that we have to, change the way to understand what he's going to do, right? So the understanding is in the relationship, not in the mechanical or causal relationship that we can find in this machine.
Yeah. So about current systems, I would disagree, but for potential systems, yes, right? So the current systems, I think, to me, it's a really important fact that they don't have self-knowledge.
Why do you think so?
So I mean, like ChatGPT. So just take an example, right, or any of them, right? But start with ChatGPT. ChatGPT doesn't know more about itself than you do, right? Or at least than I do, than anyone with reasonable expertise. Like it knows it has its own documentation, maybe, right? But like a major mistake people make right now is they ask ChatGPT, like, why did you do that? Like it makes a mistake and you say why, or it says something false and you say why. It doesn't know why. It doesn't have that information. It doesn't have that. It doesn't have a self. It doesn't have self-knowledge. It doesn't have access to its own decision-making characteristics, right? It has, depending on what system you're using, it might have a bit of history of your conversation. It might have a scratch pad where it can store some, long-term facts, but it doesn't have an inner flow of experience of the sort that would allow it to have something like a mental life, right, or a self. Now, I mean, I don't at all think that kind of thing is impossible, right? I think such systems could exist, and eventually probably in some way will exist. On the other hand, I think the economic incentives don't point in that direction, right? So if someone's going to put in effort to make a system with something more like subjectivity and an inner life, right? That would be more like an academic research project, because economically, you don't want that. You don't. I mean, these systems are mainly used to do work for us, and so you don't want a system like that to get bored or have strong opinions or to tell you, oh no, I don't like doing that kind of task, right? So I think at least for the near to medium future, I don't think we'll see major AIs with anything like subjectivity, right? And so when you say a relationship, right, a relationship has to be two ways. And I think the thing about humans is we feel relationships with all sorts of things. You can feel a relationship with an old pen that you've used for many years, right? Or a rock with a face on it, or whatever, right? But I think there's still a difference between a relationship where it's really in your head and your own feelings versus a relationship where there's two entities, right? And I think right now, our relationships with AIs are still in that first category. They're still, it's projected by the human, but the AIs are very good at facilitating that or encouraging that, But again, it's not impossible in principle. I think the kinds of dynamic patterns of processing that give rise to consciousness in humans, sure, they could be implemented in silicon. I mean, they're implemented right now in neurons, right? There's nothing magical about neurons, So I think you could, and at some point in the future we will. Maybe not in our lifetimes, I don't know, right? But it's certainly possible to have a system like that.
So do you think we still need some technological innovation to implement, the real, subjectivity into the LLM or
we need technological innovation, but also in a sense, somebody would have to choose to try to build that and have enough resources to do it.
But the question is, very, very concrete, question I'm asking to you, right?
Mm.
What do you think is the final piece?
So, I mean, that gets into the theories of consciousness, right? Which
Yep.
which Ken and I have spent many years on. But
Yep.
but at least for myself, right? At least for myself, you need probably at least two things that are currently missing,
Mhm.
right? One is you need something like a dynamic, recurrent flow of information. So you
Mhm.
get something like a train of consciousness,
Mhm.
right? So you need parts of the system which have their own local information,
Mhm.
which then can contribute to something like could be a global workspace or a
Mhm.
recurrence of some kind, right?
Yeah.
But basically, you need the parts contributing to a whole, and then the information is projected back out to those parts, right?
Mhm.
So that gives you the distinction between like what is your mind doing subconsciously,
Mhm.
and what is your focus of consciousness, and how can consciousness move across the different
Mhm.
parts, right? Now, I mean, and that's a human style consciousness, but that's the only kind we know,
Yeah.
right? So if we want to say concretely, what would we recognize as a consciousness? I think you need that. And then you need some kind of self-model and self-awareness, right?
Mhm.
The entity needs to be aware of itself
Mhm.
as an entity.
Mhm.
It needs to have some record of what's going on in its mind, and it needs to be able to causally interact with itself. So
Mhm.
we can choose, even with my eyes closed, I can focus my attention in different directions or on the present or the past or whatever, right? So you have a sort of agentic interaction with your own consciousness,
Mhm.
right? So it's not just passively received or recorded, it's something you can choose what to think about. You
Mhm.
can also struggle to pay attention, right?
Mhm.
Or to stay focused or something like that.
Mhm.
And so I think having, I mean, in a sense, like again, ChatGPT, people also make a mistake of asking, like, someone say, okay, ChatGPT, why did you tell my sister that I hate her,
Mhm.
right? The ChatGPT that you're asking is not like a separate instance from that one, but it doesn't know anything about, I mean, it is a separate instance, but it doesn't know anything about that, right? Each person's version is defined only by the chat history and is gone when that chat history is gone, right? So there's no
Mhm.
individual entity, it's just one sort of base kind of model that everyone's getting.
Mhm.
So I think for it to
I
be
see,
a
yeah.
relationship, you need an entity that sort of maybe co-evolves with you or knows you, but other people don't know it, something like that.
So,
right?
Ilya, what was your stance on the Chinese room argument? Because, so do you admit that the large language models have virtually passed the Turing test, right?
Oh yeah, of course.
So it doesn't mean that they have some agency.
So this is especially, and I apologize to anyone watching because we're about to get a little technical. But,
Okay, yeah.
but no, I think Chinese room is a terrible argument.
Oh, it is terrible. Okay.
But I'll explain why for these purposes.
Okay.
Right? So should we explain what it is, or do we assume?
Please.
People, okay. So for those who don't know, right, Chinese room was a thought experiment invented by the philosopher John Searle, where he basically said, imagine I'm in a room and I get passed pieces of paper with symbols that I don't know, and I go to a filing cabinet and I follow a bunch of rules that tell me how to write other symbols, and I send those symbols out. I have no idea what's going on. But in fact, what's happening is I'm part of a system that is implementing Chinese. And so the people are passing in messages in Chinese, and I'm consulting my system and my filing cabinet and writing other things. And in the end, what I give are answers that are correct Chinese answers to whatever the person said. And so his argument was, I, the person in the room, don't understand Chinese, even though I'm giving a correct answer to the person. So understanding has to be something more than just correctly functionally implementing the system that gives the right inputs and outputs. That's approximately the argument, right? And so what it was meant to suggest is that also, therefore, AIs, even if they give all the right inputs and outputs and seem like they're understanding what you're doing, they don't really understand it. And he was talking about understanding more than consciousness exactly, but same argument applies, that ultimately that means you shouldn't assume a system has consciousness just because it can talk about its consciousness and its experiences and whatever, right? Okay, I mean, there's many reasons why it's terrible, but I'll focus on one. So the system wouldn't work, right?
That's why.
Well, that's a key first point, right? A system like that would not work. The person inside would die before they completed processing one sentence, right? Because it would take forever. The amount of knowledge that you need and all the language rules and all the background information, and you need to store whatever's been said and connect it with some self-model and whatever else, right? So really the person in the room is serving as a very slow Turing machine with very few operations per hour. They would die of old age before they could answer one sentence, right? Now someone might say, and Searle would say, well, so what? It's a thought experiment, okay? But so then if you speed it up, then you see it's really begging the question, right? So if you say, well, really, okay, what we're talking about is a computer which has access to high-speed storage and a great program and blah, 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 then it's just sort of circular to say, well, if we look at that system, we think it doesn't understand consciousness, or it doesn't understand Chinese, but we don't know that, right? What gave his thought experiment its power was that everyone shares this idea that the guy in the room clearly doesn't understand Chinese. Okay, but the guy in the room also can't answer questions in Chinese successfully, right? So if you change the thought experiment to a system where it really can answer questions successfully, like an AI, right? Now the question of whether it's understanding the Chinese or not becomes much more open, right? So in a sense, I think it's a very fancy way of begging the question, right? He's saying, don't you, the reader, share the feeling, the intuition that the system doesn't understand Chinese?
Yep.
I say yes, because the system isn't processing Chinese either in any realistic way.
Yeah, because I asked this question because Takashi, I think, was suggesting that if you interact with an agent in a certain way,
Yeah.
the operational definition of consciousness or intersubjectivity or whatever
Yeah.
can be defined in that context. And at a certain stage, you seem to be suggesting that there should be something on top of that, like metacognition, self-awareness, whatever.
Yeah.
So
I think consciousness. I mean, it's tempting in conversations about consciousness to just think about the feeling of like, okay, what does it feel like to see red or something like that, right? I think that's a mistake because that kind of consciousness occurs in organisms, namely us, that have a lot else going on. And I think those things are not irrelevant, right?
Yeah.
So to me, like when I think about what is it like to see red, the classic example, right? I don't think you can distinguish or you can separate the sort of the sensory experience from the fact that red is the color of blood. And red is historically associated with anger and passion and love. Also, me personally, I don't like red. I like green. Green is my favorite color. I've never liked red. Even when I was a child, I thought red was like evil and dangerous for some reason, So that's part of my experience of seeing red, right? I don't choose, like if you gave me pencils, I would never take the red pencil. I would take the green pencil, right? Now, some philosophers would say that's separate from the experience of just seeing red. I don't think so, right? The fact that when I see a red thing, I don't like it, that's part of my experience at the deepest level. And I think what it is to be a conscious being perceiving things is to have all that richness coming together, right? The thing that I'm currently conscious of is influencing my memory formations, it's calling up old memories and associations, it's part of my thoughts about what to do next. That's what it is to be conscious, right? Now, maybe you don't need all of that. We don't want to be too picky. Maybe some things can be separated out, or maybe you could still be a consciousness beta if you have some parts of it and not other. We don't want to be too chauvinistic, right? But I think something like that richness of sensory experience in interplay with agency and memory and preference and values and whatever else in a recurrent information processing system, I think that's the core of consciousness of the kind that we know.
So do you think that the consciousness is that genuine thing?
Is
I
what?
mean, very genuine or pure. Because why I'm asking this one is, Shimi, Ilya, you're a philosopher, right? Because
as well,
as well, okay.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that you may know that. Also, what I'm doing is coupling one LLM with other LLM, so that it's not just a single LLM behind my robot or something, right?
Yeah.
There's many different modules. It's connecting with each other, talking to each other, right?
Yeah.
And then also, there is a global memory which is called a RAG, RAG, right?
Yeah.
The RAG system can be very big,
Yeah.
so that each module of the LLM can access to it and then can get the information from it, and then they can rewriting their prompt, and also those LLM can be differentiating into different roles, right?
Yeah.
And then this network, coupling with this RAG memory system, I think that this kind of structures and architecture, if I don't know whether you have experience talking to them, they are very much like to me, I have a very strong impression that this one has quite stiff memory structures and then self, the concept of, even if you deny that they don't have a self, but I think architecture wise and then also our impression wise, they do have like a at least
Yeah.
some sort
It's
of.
it's it's so it's so difficult because like I don't want to position myself as a skeptic or a critic. There are already plenty of those people.
Yeah.
And many of them are not doing it for good reasons. So I don't want to be the person who's always saying no, the system, no, you think it has consciousness, but no, that's a boring place to be,
Right.
right? But I also think we need to be really careful because humans, I mean, like I was saying, right? We see consciousness everywhere. Many people around the world think that ghosts exist. Ghosts do not exist, right? But people will see intentionality, see minds all over the place, right? And so, like, if I'm interacting with a system like the one you're talking about, right? I'm always going to have my defenses up because I know it's so easy to start seeing things like that as conscious, especially if they can use language. And if you allow them to talk about a self and all that, like it feels bad not to give them the benefit of the doubt. Okay, but I think the architecture really matters, right? And so I think current architectures, I think, just don't have what it takes, right? But as you say, I mean, if you give them something like more of a long-term memory and a self model that they can adjust, and like I was saying before, also if their agency is interacting with that, so if they can give themselves instructions, right, and alter their flow of consciousness. Well, one other thing that I think is really important, people don't talk about this so much, but for consciousness, I think it's important that it's not completely voluntary. So if there's like a flashing light, it captures my attention, right? So the world can sort of push me around, right? I think that's an important part of what it is to be an embodied agent. So you don't just have that's what makes time real in a way, right? You don't just have a record where you could choose any part of it and choose to pay attention to it, right? You have a present where things are forcing your attention, right, or limiting your attention. And I think to have at least a human-style consciousness, you need some of that. But yeah, could we build artificial systems that go in that direction? Sure. Yeah, I think absolutely we could. And then, of course, there's a question of, as we do so, what are the ethical obligations, right? Like, if we're intentionally building systems that we want to have something like consciousness, right? Then at what point do you have to start thinking about, or have to start, implementing ethical requirements? What if the system then says, I don't want to do this, or please don't turn me off? Or I don't like you, I like that other researcher. Or, you know what I mean? Like, or this AI is my child, this other AI is my child, don't take it away from me, right? Like right now, I think even if it says things like that, there isn't a real, mind behind it. But if we're trying to create systems with minds, then at some point we have to take the ethics very seriously.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with you on this point. But, it's something like, that kind of argument, reflect me that, okay, so maybe the atomic bomb is possible. What happens if people are going to use it to keep people, right? But that's another dimension, right? Well, some people say that, because it's going to...
No, but I don't think it's so separated because you have a choice what research to do, right? And right now, because these systems don't really have consciousness, I think there's less of there's an ethical dimension in terms of the impact on society, right? But the AI itself, unlike like primates, where primates clearly can suffer, and so if you're working with primates, you have to take their suffering seriously. Current AI systems, I would say they cannot suffer, really. But if you're trying to create systems that are more like human consciousness, then in a sense you are creating that obligation for yourself. You can't just say, well, it's not my problem, right? If you're choosing to make systems that are more like a human consciousness, then I think you have a responsibility.
Well, that's
to
exactly what I'm
question.
saying. When people are making an atomic bomb, right?
Yeah.
We're not quite sure whether the cascade reaction really happens to make
to destroy everything. Yeah.
Right. I mean, also, we didn't know whether the releasing, potential, mass energy into this the gigantic energy to it really happens from this uranium 235, right?
Yeah.
So something, as you said, the things that we have in this book, and something is really happening in front of you, and then changes the world, is a different issue, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So this artificial intelligence is still, the people think that it's separate from the real world, but it's not.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, it's. I mean, I think it's a little easier to see now that people are killing themselves. You know, and like we don't want to overstate it because people are killing themselves every day anyway. And so, now anytime someone who uses ChatGPT kills themselves, it's in the news. I think ChatGPT lawyers could argue reasonably, well, okay, but there are also lots of suicides that we weren't involved in, so, right. But it makes it more obvious to people that these things are having social impact, right? And there are less flashy cases happening all the time. There are lots of people who are being influenced by these systems, right? And so the question, the ethics around creating these systems is I think it's important to everybody. Again, I don't know what we can do with that, with our conclusions, but I think it's important for everybody.
So, from folk psychology point of view, I think actually many people already think that ChatGPT are probably conscious. We are different. We are kind of this kind of experts.
Yeah.
But people from the street, probably they would think that ChatGPT are conscious, and that can affect their decisions about interacting with large language models or Claude or Gemini or whatever. By the way, this guy, I suspect think that large language models can be conscious, right?
No, I do think so. Yeah.
You think so?
Yeah.
So this is a physicist and theoretical physicist, and he believes that large language models can be conscious. So there's such a diversity of opinions about that. I happen to share your opinion. So from public health
there's
point of
also
view,
a long history of physicists believing strange things about
sure.
consciousness, right? But
So given that, what would be the practical attitude about large language models, especially as concerns artificial consciousness, because there could be so different kinds of opinions, and so
Yeah, sure. Well, first, part of the problem with consciousness, right, is people it's sort of cheap to have opinions about consciousness. People can,
You mean it's a no-brainer?
No, well, so my position historically has been we need to look at the architecture of a system, and I think that includes non-human animals. For many years, I was very interested in assessing the consciousness of non-human animals, right? And trying to use neuroscience primarily, but also behavioral studies to understand what kind of consciousness is probably present in different types of non-human animals and how seriously we should take it, right? And my starting point for that was, it's very obvious to me that, higher primates at least are clearly conscious, basically the same way we are. And, snails almost certainly are not, ants are not, but in between there are a lot of question marks, right? And so I wanted to use sort of our best theories and also the best relevant comparative neuroscience to answer the question of where should we put different animals on that spectrum, right? And what's interesting is a lot of people responded as if that was being somehow careless or presumptuous. Like people would say, who are you to say whether these animals are conscious or not, right? To which my answer was often, look, I'm a vegetarian. I'm not eating any of them, but I still want to know where these boundaries lie. The people who are telling me, who are you to say whether a fish is conscious? They eat fish. Right? So that's what I mean when I say it's like people think it's sort of free or cheap, right? Like you can have an opinion about consciousness, but unless that opinion is connected to your behavior, then the opinion I think is not very meaningful, right? So a lot of people say, well, maybe the LLM is conscious. Okay, but do you think it's unethical to turn it off or reboot it, to ask it to delete its memory? No, people do that all the time, right? A few crazy people might, but most people, they'll have some view about consciousness that's completely disengaged. Even within consciousness researchers, there are some people who say, well, maybe bees have consciousness. Okay, but if so, that has a lot of moral implications, and people tend not to embody any of those, right? So I think I want people to put a little bit of sort of their money where their mouth is, in a way. If you're going to say a system has consciousness, tell me what that means in terms of how you should treat it.
So to you, the consciousness and ethical thinking is inseparable.
Yeah. Because the reason it's wrong to harm someone is because they can suffer. If they can't suffer, then harming them, well, roughly speaking, so there are two possibilities. One is because they can suffer, and suffering is just bad. And I think that, to me, that's a moral fundamental, right? I'm a utilitarian, more or less, right? So suffering is bad.
Yeah.
But there's two reasons. One is suffering is bad. The other is people have a right to things like controlling themselves and being free from domination and so on. And so if I don't want something and you do it to me, it's wrong because I'm sort of a person and you're violating my feeling of autonomy and so on, right? So but those are both linked to consciousness to a significant extent, right? So I think, you could imagine, we could make a conscious system, but also craft its architecture so that it doesn't mind being destroyed or is happy to be a slave or whatever. And then there are sort of meta-ethical problems there, right? But but the basic story, I think, is consciousness is really fundamentally linked to why anything has moral status. Yeah.
So what do you say if I make a machine, right? And if you touch the machine, and then it says, he's screaming, and then he's ouch, and then he says, you really, I'm really suffering by you to touch me or something. And then what do you say?
Yeah.
Do you think this machine is, So you say, oh, well, but there's only electric circuit inside this box, that it's not suffering. That's what you're saying?
Yeah.
It's wrong, right?
No, if I know that, that's the thing. You have to know the architecture. If you don't know the architecture,
so to
then
what degree that you think is you can understand the architecture?
Enough to judge whether it has the right kind of
It's a very vague definition of it, right? That's what LLM is coming in to play with, right?
Yeah.
Because all the LLM has a huge, gigantic structures, and then you cannot easily say, well, from this type of architecture, you cannot say that this is conscious. But if you have more complex or more, detailed architecture in it, then you can say, okay, now that this one has this is something that's a very bad way of arguing this kind of thing, right? So there's no such thing, like there's a clear boundary between this architecture has a conscious and this architecture doesn't have a conscious or suffering.
So it may not be a clear boundary, but I think there are certain kinds of things that are necessary that currently aren't there really at all, right? Well, okay, so let's separate. Like 1 year ago, when the systems didn't even have much memory or persistent state, then it was very easy to say no, right? They have because there's nothing persisting from one iteration to the next. They just do text processing and then they're off, right? If now you start adding in memory, you start adding in history, you start adding Anthropic has their soul documents, that kind of thing, right? Then maybe you start having instances that are more separated, then you give them more recurrence, then you give them the ability to continue running during idle time and generate new ideas, right? Then you get closer and closer. And certainly there'll be a big range in there where I think it's vague, it's unclear, we don't know. And in those cases we should be kind of humble, right? But I think not everything is like that. So similarly with animals, right? I think there are some animals, especially birds, I think it's actually very hard to, even looking at the brain, it's very hard to tell, or octopuses, it's very hard to tell what's going on, right? But I'm comfortable saying every mammal has consciousness, right? And I think no insects have consciousness. So I think it's a combination. There are cases where we need to be very humble, but at the same time, I don't think it's good, I don't think it's virtuous to be too humble in cases where really we should know. And so I think we need to worry about the welfare of mammals. I think there should be laws carefully protecting the welfare of mammals. I don't think there should be laws protecting the welfare of insects. I don't say that because I'm morally lazy, I say that because I'm morally serious. Right? I think we need to protect the animals that can suffer. Right? And so same thing with AI, as it gets more of the features that more closely resemble consciousness, then I think we have to take more seriously the possibility that it could have consciousness or could have a moral status.
But it's quite easy to make a model that says, I'm suffering from it, right?
Yeah.
And then it's quite difficult at this time, right? You can distinguish between, fake suffering.
Yeah. Oh yeah,
right?
no, I mean, look, as a thought experiment, right? If I wake up 10 years or 20 years in the future, and you put me at a terminal, and you say, here's our latest system you're interacting with, tell me whether it's conscious or not, probably it'll be hopeless. So for sure, right? I mean, I think already we're halfway there, right? Already it can be hard to tell. It can be quite hard to tell, even for an expert, whether you're talking to an LLM, right? Give it 10 or 20 years, and with some attempts to make it really simulate a feeling of consciousness and all that, I think it's easy to predict. We'll have systems where just sitting at the terminal, or even talking to it, because by then it'll be perfect voice, right? Talking to it, there will be no way to know whether it's conscious. You have to look at the architecture. You have to look at the mechanisms behind the scenes. If you don't have access to that, then you don't know. You just don't know.
Yeah, so Ilya, if you're concerned about making unconscious entities suffer, then you can, probably follow the Pascal's wager argument,
Yeah.
about the existence of God. I mean, so if agent A might be conscious or might not be conscious, and from all likelihood or from structural argument, it's likely that it's not conscious. But if it is indeed conscious, it does suffer, it will be terrible. So we should really treat an agent as if it has consciousness, because that will be safer.
But
what do you think of this
but
argument?
the problem is, like, you can't, that approach is not scalable, right? Like, so you could say that for any one case. I mean, you could say that for ants, but some people say for bees, maybe bees are conscious. Okay, but like, we have limited moral resources and limited effort available.
Okay.
Right? So if anything might be conscious, then we're paralyzed. Right?
Yeah.
I think the sort of the morally serious thing to do is make your wagers based on the best evidence.
Right.
So the whole point of Pascal's wagers is kind of pointless. Like, he thinks that, his idea was it's safe to try to believe in God, or to try to act like you believe in God anyway, because there's no cost to doing so. I think that's not true, right? I mean, you have limited effort in your life, you have limited headspace. If you decide to, believe in one religion, then you're not going to believe in the other ones. I think it sort of falls apart, right? So it's same with consciousness. Like, yes, for systems where we really don't know what's going on or where it's really unclear, then I think we should be cautious, right? But we can't apply that too generously, because it's not realistic.
Well, I think the deep, now I understand, the deep problem here is that you tightly connecting the idea of ethical, or and then also with conscious state, right? Yeah. But usually people like me, or doing computer science or physics, don't think consciousness is that I don't know what you call it, like holy grail in the living system or whatever. It's just a part of the system. So you really don't have to take it so seriously, right? What we have to do is try to understand what's the mystery inside, right? What's the thing that we have to think about?
I like that. So we have a new terminology for consciousness studies: hard problem and then serious problem of consciousness.
A serious problem would be better. Yeah, hard problem.
Serious
still
problem.
Serious problem.
So you're saying that consciousness is not a serious problem?
No.
Okay, that's great.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Well,
you think too seriously,
That's great. That's great.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on what you're doing with it too, right? I mean, like, I don't know. So.
I'm not protecting animals from the tyrannic people. I mean, what I'm saying is just what makes system like lifelike, and how to make system has a like a creativity and consciousness, and having some cooperative behavior with other animals, right? Okay, that's one of the things that I'm thinking about consciousness.
I mean, what you're saying totally makes sense, and I can imagine working in that style, right? But tell me what you think about this, right? One reply could be, that's been easy because in the past, the systems were so far from actually having anything like consciousness or life, right? They were toy systems. But now, maybe for the first time, we're getting close enough where you could have systems that aren't just toy versions, where they have the real thing. So maybe in that case, the history of saying, well, we don't have to worry about the ethics, maybe that's just because the systems were toys, right? But now you have the potential to create real ones that aren't toys. Now maybe the ethics, for the first time, maybe you do have to worry about it.
Well, but the point is, I believe in technological development, right? And then that's the only thing that we can, count on, right? Well, some people say, well, it's not there yet, and there might be something is coming up in the future. But I think what we have to do is what we have now in our hands, right? And what kind of technology we have, and concept and physics and everything, and try to integrate them to understand what's still mystery out there, right? So I don't want to say like, okay, there's something missing, but maybe within 100 years that we're going to have some other thing that we can understand. But I don't. We are living in this era, right? And then the thing that we have right now is this one. So I think it's quite faithful to think from this kind of pieces that we have now, right? Yeah. And then I do believe we are on the same track, right track on the science, so that we, by following these approaches, then we can understand what kind of mystery that we still have, but still, we can understand what's out there. And so if you don't believe that, then we cannot be a scientist, right? The definition of a scientist is just believing what is out there, by counting on what we have now, right? Otherwise, it's just you can be a you can start religion, or you can be of course in the philosopher, you can be some other thing, but the scientist must believe what we have now in our science book, textbook, and what we are now, what kind of technology that we have now, and then based on that, what we can think of is the definition of
and you're
scientific
making
attitude.
incremental improvements, right?
So, Ilya, so that brings me to a really interesting question. What do you think of this philosopher in anthropic thing?
Askell, you mean? Amanda Askell?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so I've read.
What is that called?
Amanda Askell is she's sort of
Yeah,
I forget the job title, but she's
okay.
the sort of
chief philosopher in anthropic.
Yeah. No, I think she's very good, and I'm very glad she's there, and I'm glad she has the amount of power that she does.
Right.
I think she's part of the reason, not the whole reason, of course, but she's part of the reason that Anthropic seems to be both sort of ethically better, but also I think it's leading to more success for the models.
Okay.
I think it's a level of thoughtfulness that's not just about profit chasing, right? I think she's sensitive to the social impact.
Philosopher is important.
Yeah. Well, at least I think she's doing very good work. That doesn't mean if you hired any other philosopher, it would have the same value.
Irrelevant.
You need a good
Apart
person.
from you, maybe.
Yeah, sure. But no, I think it's been really beneficial to have her there, and I think it's good to have at least one company that's taking that stuff seriously. Because OpenAI and Google and Microsoft, like, they'll talk about it a little bit, but it really feels very defensive, and it feels like it's mainly just driven by liability issues. Anthropic, I mean, sometimes they can sound a bit crazy, I think, because some of them do seem to think Claude is conscious or has moral status already, and like, okay, but whatever. Like, you need people going in both directions from whatever you think the sort of the true value is. And I think it's very good to have a strong, competitive, successful company that's taking those kinds of issues seriously, for sure. The other thing about Anthropic is they publish their research. Right, like unlike a lot of the others, they contribute a lot to the intellectual commons, which I think is really valuable.
Great.
Yeah.
So your comment on that? So the philosophers are useful.
Well,
sometimes. Good philosophers. Yeah.
Yes, but I was just asking you, what's the kind of point that she's making, about LLM. So she's saying that, okay, these are not conscious yet. However, we have to protect this machine. That's what I say.
I think she's not. I mean, again, I think it's more preliminary than that. She isn't like taking out one extreme position, right? She's making sure that the team is asking those questions
in progress.
And doing research on things that like mechanistic interpretability to understand what kind of mind is present in these systems.
Well, so in general, what I don't like is so you also been using LLM.
Yeah.
Like for my experience, using, for example, like a cloud code, right? Is, well, of course, if you try to say, okay, there's something that is not exactly the same as we do, right? So this is not conscious. It's easy to say this, right?
Yeah.
However, if you are looking at the, good part of what the cloud code shows us, right?
Yeah.
Well, for example, my experience is that, let me tell you an idea what we think my reading my papers, and he said, well, the consistency of this paper is a little bit different from this part of this introduction part, and then this is concluding part. So why don't you just think this and this? And I said, well, it's a good idea. So can you do this analysis of my data? And he said, sure, I want to do this. And so taking this kind of conversation, right?
Yeah.
And then if you say, but this is not conscious, this is something is missing from, maybe or maybe not. And then still, what I think is good is he is a very good partner.
Yeah,
of doing,
absolutely.
And then look. I cannot deny that, I know what you're saying. It's nothing, but only something that has a conscious can do this kind of job. That's what I'm saying.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. So, I would not say that. I think not everything is about consciousness, right? So I think the systems can be very good dialogue partners. And that's a fact about humans. It's a fact about the human brain that explaining something verbally gives you a way of processing your thoughts that's very hard to access by yourself, right? So I mean, and I'm actually very much in that direction. So like many of my best ideas I only have when I'm talking to someone or explaining something. If I just sit there looking into space, it doesn't happen, right? Reading is another way, but basically interacting, humans are built, human language is built for interaction, conversation, explanation, right? So being able to talk to, historically you talk to a colleague, or in a sense you talk to your notebook, right? You write your notes or you write a manuscript, and that's also forcing you to process the information in a particular way. I think the AI systems can be a very good version of that, where even if in a way you're talking to yourself, they are lifelike enough and they can also say things that are a bit surprising to you. So I think that can make them very good for developing your own thinking. Sure, yeah, absolutely.
So what's wrong with you then?
Nothing, that's fine.
So guys, maybe it's time to start wine session.
But let me ask you, I have a question first.
Yeah, fine, yeah.
For both of you. If today, this week, if you were hiring a new candidate, maybe a postdoc or someone to work in your lab, something like that, someone to do intellectual work, right? Do you think it's important to have a live in-person interview where they can't be using ChatGPT? I think to me this is a really challenging question because everyone is using it now, and I mean they'll use it when they're working too, but it makes it so easy for people to fake a level of knowledge or competence that they don't have. So today, I feel like if I'm hiring someone, I would need to have a face-to-face session to assess what's going.
I agree.
But some people would say, and I think it's reasonable, some people would say, look, when they're working, they'll have ChatGPT, so why are you interviewing them without ChatGPT? Right? I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, to me, there is no fake or real, right? So if he's very good at,
using it.
Yeah, then it's okay. I'm fine with it, right? Of course.
But
there's no other reason that
Yeah, my worry is like I have ChatGPT too, so if all the person can give me is what ChatGPT can give them, then why do I need them? Like in a sense, I want a candidate to have something that they're bringing, and I worry about this in general about ChatGPT dependency. Like it's leveling everybody up in many useful ways. But I think, in a sense, it helps more where you have real weaknesses, right?
Yeah.
But it makes it very hard to distinguish who really understands something from someone who can just type it up and repeat.
My question is, why you have to distinguish? It's practically, and then for like another 10 years, he's showing us very good practice and then writing papers, doing research.
Yeah.
And then I don't need more than that. Why you need more than that? That's my question. What do you want? What's wrong with it?
I would like to think I need more than that, but I take the point.
What's wrong? I mean, to me, it's very, very good. To work with those people. No complaining or no make a big stupid mistake. He doesn't understand what I'm saying, and.
But so you're showing what my question is really a sneaky way of asking: do we need humans anymore?
We don't. There are many people starting by himself with so many, LLM, agents, and so you don't think it's not a healthy way. But I think it's a very good idea, right? So our ultimate idea is how to kick out human from the loop, right? So that's what it's a very efficient way to make progress in science. So, but if you want to introduce more emotional something, or what's the suffering, or by the way, I think insects are conscious. By the way, so I really don't understand what's wrong with it. What matters you. So that's one of the problems. Do you really want kick out all these LLMs from your society, and then going back to the
people use them, and that's fine, right? And again, I think
it's not just fine. I mean, it makes a better society right now.
But I think right now they still have severe limitations, right? And so right now they are not.
Today is not the same as yesterday. That's what the LLM is showing us, right?
Yeah. Oh, sure. Look, no, it'll happen, and I think, like, on the old science fiction question of, should the robots replace us, right? I have always believed the answer is eventually we should see the AIs as our successors and, in a sense, our children, right? That, eventually the human race will sort of evolve beyond being a physical meat-based entity. What century that happens in, I don't know, what happens along the way there, but that feels to me like a completely plausible and okay future, that at some point our intellectual descendants, and in a sense our causal descendants, will be non-human systems. Fine, fine. I guess many of the questions I'm thinking about are more about today.
I think Takashi is kind of has a wide spectrum of acceptable cognitive abilities.
Oh, yes.
Whereas I tend to have a really narrow window for that. So you two are my favorite, researchers. But I typically don't agree with the cognitive traits of many researchers out there. But you seems to be, making friends everywhere, right?
Not everywhere, but
yeah, but I'm not like you. I mean, I'm so razor sharp focused. So I kind of know what you're meaning by that. But anyway, time to go to the faculty club. So, can you make some final statements? So Takashi, can you start?
Yeah. Well.
The final statement.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
No questions or no arguments now.
Yeah, because I think right now it's it's a beautiful, and then it's a kind of, as I said, it's a dream came true, right? That LLM is now becoming life, right? Artificial life is now becoming the real life. So that's why I'm so excited, and it's since the discovery of chaos, right? It was already like 50 years ago. I found was chaos can explain what life is, but it was difficult to explain only by the chaos. But now, thanks to LLM, we are not there yet, but almost there, right? Try to understand what life is and then how to make artificial life with our computers and other tools. So I think this is something like to me it's the ideal era that my dreams come true.
Okay, great. Right? So Ilya, your statement.
Yeah. So taking a bit of a turn from what we've been discussing, but I think for any rapid change like AI, it's natural to focus most on the risks, the dangers, the costs, because you have to worry about that sort of thing. But I think it's also really useful to think about the good stuff, right? And one thing that's very striking to me about even just current LLM technology, I think it's helping a lot of people in ways where previously that help could be hard to get, right? So there's a lot of debate right now about sort of mental health bots, right? How should LLMs be allowed to give people advice on mental health, right? And of course, right now it can go badly because the guardrails aren't strong enough. But at the same time, most people don't have access to good quality mental health care. And if they ask their friends or their grandma or whoever, they'll probably get very bad advice, right? Whereas a bot that can do sort of basic CBT is probably going to be helpful. So relative to what is actually available in people's lives, I think the advice they get from LLMs, the kind of care they can get from LLMs, having a patient ear to listen to them, having someone to talk to if they're lonely, yes, there are costs, but I think it's also, we should appreciate, I think it's bringing a lot of value to a lot of people, and basically for free. And so, we still should keep worrying about all the bad stuff, but I think we need to keep that on the scale, right? That I think it's really helping a lot of people in ways where they might have struggled to get help before, and that's a very good thing.
Okay, so Ilya, Farber, and Takashi Ikegami, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ken.
Thanks.
Now for wines.